at least have not run up against the hawk, or Tuatha with a sword. Now that would be the strangest of all, for I am a wool merchant. Stop asking questions, Serene. He swung up into Stepper's saddle. You will find out what Moraine decides to tell you. She tried not to look at the stone. She turned those dark, tilted eyes on him. I do not think you know why, blacksmith. I think that is why you will not tell me, because you cannot. Admit it, farm boy. With a small sigh, he rode off the docks after Moraine and land. Serene did not dig at Loyal in that cutting way when the Ogier refused to answer her questions. He thought she must be trying to browbeat him into using that name. He would not. Moraine had tied the oiled cloak behind her saddle, atop the innocuous-looking bundle that held the dragon banner, and despite the heat, had donned the blue linen cloak from Ilion. Its deep, wide hood hid her face. Her great serpent ring was tears she had forbid the presence of Aes Sedai, only channeling. But the defenders of the stone kept a close eye on any woman who wore the ring. She did not want to be watched on this visit to Tyr. Lan had stuffed his color-shifting cloak into his saddlebags 2 days earlier. When it had become apparent that whoever had sent the Darkhounds, Samael, Aaron thought with a shiver and tried not to think of the name at all, whoever had sent them had not sent any more pursuit. The warder had made no concessions to the heat of Ilion, and he made none to the lesser heat of Tyr. His gray-green coat was buttoned up all the way. Theron wore his coat half undone and the neck of his shirt untied. Tyr might be a little cooler than Ilion, but it was still as hot as summer in the Two Rivers. And as always after rain, the dampness of the air made the heat seem worse. His axe belt hung looped around the tall pommel of his saddle. It was handy there, if he needed it. And he felt better not wearing it. He was surprised at the mud in the first streets they rode along. Only villages and smaller towns that he had seen. It was one of the great cities. People did not seem to mind many going barefoot. A woman walking on little wooden platforms caught his attention for a time, and he wondered why they did not all wear them. Those baggy breeches on the men looked as if they might be cooler than the snug ones he wore, but he was sure he would feel a fool if he tried them. He made a picture in his head of himself wearing those breeches, one of those round straw hats, and chuckled at it.
What do you find funny, Aaron?
Loyal asked. His ears were drooping till their tufts were hidden in his hair, and he looked at the people in the street worriedly.
These folk look defeated, Aaron. They did not look this way when I was here last. Even people who let their grove be cut down do not deserve to look like this.
As Perrin began to study faces instead of just looking at everything at once, he saw that Loyal was right. Something had gone out of too many of those faces. Hope, maybe. Curiosity. They barely glanced at the party riding by, except to get out of the way of the horses. The Ogier, mounted on an animal as big as a draft horse, might as well have been Lan or Perrin. The streets changed, gaining wide stone paving after they passed inside the gates of the high gray city wall, past the hard, dark eyes of soldiers in breastplates, over red coats with wide sleeves ending in narrow white cuffs, and rimmed, round helmets with a ridge over the top. Instead of the baggy breeches other men wore, theirs were tight and tucked into knee-high boots. The soldiers frowned at Lan's sword and fingered their own, stared sharply at Perrin's axe and his bow, but in a way, despite their frowns and sharp looks, there was something beaten in their faces, too, as if nothing were really worth the effort any longer. The buildings were larger and taller inside the walls, though most were made no differently from those outside. The roofs looked a bit odd to Perrin, especially those that came to points. But he had seen so many different kinds of roofs since leaving home that he only wondered what kind of nails they used with their tiles. In some places, the people did not use nails on their roof tiles at all. Palaces and great buildings stood among the smaller and more ordinary, seemingly placed haphazardly. A structure of towers and squarish white domes, surrounded on all sides by wide streets, might have shops and inns and houses on the other sides of those streets. A huge hall fronted by squared columns of marble 4 paces on a side, with 50 steps to climb to reach bronze doors 5 spans high, had a bakery one side and a tailor on the other. More men wore coats and breeches like the soldiers here, though in brighter colors and without armor. And some even wore swords. None of them went barefoot, not even those in baggy breeches. The women's dresses were often longer, their necklines lower to bare shoulders and even bosom. The cloth is likely to be silk as wool. The sea folk traded a good deal of silk through Tyr, as many sedan chairs and carriages drawn by teams of horses moved through the streets as ox carts and wagons. Yet too many of the faces had that same look of having given up. The inland shows, the Star, had a weaver's shop on one side and a smithy on the other, with narrow alleyways between. The smithy was of undressed gray stone, the weaver's and the inn of wood, though the Star stood 4 stories tall and had small windows in its roof as well. The rattle of looms was hard-pressed to compete with the clang of a smith's hammer. They handed their horses over to stablemen to be taken around back and went inside the inn. There were fish smells from the kitchen, baking, and perhaps stewing, and the scent of roast mutton. The men in the common room all wore the tight coats and loose breeches. Banner did not think richer men. Somehow he was sure the men in colorful coats with puffy sleeves and the bare-shouldered women in bright silk were all rich, or nobles. Those folk would not put up with the noise. Perhaps that was why Lan had chosen it. "How are we supposed to sleep with this racketing?" Zareen muttered. "No questions?" he said with a smile. For a moment he thought she was going to stick out her tongue at him. The innkeeper was a round-faced, balding man in a long, deep blue coat and those loose breeches, who bowed over hands clasped across his stout belly. His face had that look, a weary resignation.
"The light shine on you, mistresses, and welcome,"
he sighed.
"The light shine on you, masters, and welcome."
He gave a small start at Perrin's yellow eyes, then passed wearily on to Loyal.
"The light shine on you, friend Ogier, and welcome. It is a year or more since I have seen one of your kind in Tyr. Some work or other at the stone. They stayed in the stone, of course, but I saw them in the street one day."
He finished with another sigh, seemingly unable to summon any curiosity as to why another Ogier had come to Tyr, or why any of them had come, for that matter. The balding man, whose name was Juraharit, showed them to their rooms himself. Apparently, Moraine's silk dress and the way she kept her face hidden, taken with Lan's hard face and sword, made them a lady and her guard in his eyes, and so worthy of his personal attention. Perrin he obviously took as some kind of retainer, and Zareen he was plainly unsure of, to her visible disgust. And Loyal was, after all, an Ogier. He called men to push beds together for Loyal, and offered Moraine meals if she wished. She accepted graciously. They kept together through it all, making a small procession through the upper halls until Harit bowed and sighed his way out of their presence, leaving them all where they had begun, outside Moraine's room. The walls were white plaster, and Loyal's head brushed the hall ceiling. "Odious fellow," Zareen muttered, brushing furiously at the dust on her narrow skirts with both hands. "I believe he took me for your handmaid, Aes Sedai. I will not stand for that." "Watch your tongue," Lan said softly. "If you use that name where folk can hear, you will regret it, girl." She looked as if she were going to argue, but his icy blue eyes stilled her tongue this time, if it did not cool her glare. Moraine ignored them. Staring off at nothing, she worked her cloak in her hands, almost as if wiping them, unaware what she was doing, in Perrin's opinion. "How do we go about finding Rand?" he asked, but she did not appear to hear him. "Moraine?" "Remain close to the inn," she said after a moment. "Tyr can be a dangerous city for those who do not know its ways. The pattern can be torn here." That last was soft, as if to herself. In a stronger voice, she said, "Lan, let us see what we can discover without attracting attention. The rest of you, stay close to the inn." "Stay close to the inn," as the Aes Sedai and the warder disappeared down the stairs. But she said it quietly enough that they would not hear. "This Rand, he is the one you called the..." If she looked like a falcon right then, it was a very uneasy falcon. "And we are in Tyr, where the heart of the stone holds, and the prophecies say, the light burning. It's a demon. You story I ought to be in." a moment, Perrin felt almost as hopeless as the innkeeper had sounded. The wheel weaves us into the pattern. You chose to tangle your thread with ours. It's too late to untangle it now. Light, she growled. Now you sound like her. He left her there with Loyal and went to put his things in his room. It had a low bed, comfortable but small, as city people seem to think befitted a servant. A washstand, a stool, and a few pegs on the cracked plaster wall. And when he came out, they were both gone. The ring of hammer on anvil called to him. So much in Tyr looked odd that it was a relief to walk into the smithy. The ground floor was all one large room with no back wall except for two long doors that stood open on a yard for shoeing horses and oxen, complete with an ox sling. Hammers stood in their stands, tongs of various kinds and sizes hung on the exposed joists of walls, buttresses and hoof knives and other farrier's tools lay neatly arranged on wooden benches, with chisels and beak irons and swages, and all the implements of the blacksmith's craft. Bins held lengths of iron and steel in various thicknesses. 5 grinding wheels of different roughness stood about the hard dirt floor, 6 anvils, and 3 stone-sided forges with their bellows, though only one held glowing coals. Quenching barrels stood ready to hand. The smith was plying his hammer on yellow-hot iron gripped in heavy tongs. He wore baggy breeches and had pale blue eyes, but the long leather vest over his bare chest and apron were not much different from those Perrin and Master Luhan had worn back in Emond's Field, and his thick arms and shoulders spoke of years working metal. His dark hair had almost the same amount of gray that Perrin remembered in Master Luhan's. More vests and aprons hung on the wall as if the man had apprentices, but they were not in evidence now. The forge fire smelled like home. The hot iron smelled like home. The smith turned to thrust the piece he was working back into the coals, and Perrin stepped over to work the bellows for him. The man glanced at him, but said nothing. Perrin pulled the bellows handle up and down with slow, steady, even strokes, keeping the coals at the right heat. The smith went back to working the hot iron on the rounded horn of the anvil this time. Perrin thought he might be making a barrel scrape. The hammer rang with sharp, quick blows. The man spoke without looking up from his work. "Apprentice?" was all he said. "Yes," Perrin replied, just as simply. The smith worked on for a time. It was a barrel scrape, for cleaning the insides of wooden barrels. Now and again he eyed Perrin consideringly. Setting his hammer down just for a moment, the smith picked up a short length of thick, square stock and pushed it into Perrin's hand, then picked up his hammer again and resumed work. "See what you can do with that," he said. Thinking about it, Perrin stepped over to the on the other side of the forge and tapped the steel on its edge. It made a nice ring. The steel had not been left long enough in the slow furnace to pick up a great deal of carbon from the coal. He pushed it into the hot coals for almost its entire length, tasted the 2 water barrels to see which had been salted. The third was olive oil. Then took off his coat and shirt and chose a leather vest that would fit his chest. Most of these tyrant fellows were not as large as he, but he found one that would do. Finding an apron was easier. When he turned around, he saw the smith, still with his head down over his work, nodding and smiling to himself. But just because he knew his way around a smithy did not mean he had any skill at smithing. That was yet to be shown. When he came back to the anvil with 2 hammers, a set of long-handled flat tongs, and a sharp-topped hardy, the steel bar had heated to a dark red, except for a small bit of which he had left out of the coals. He worked the bellows, watching the color of the metal lighten, until it reached a yellow just short of white. Then he pulled it out with the tongs, laid it on the anvil, and picked up the heavier of the 2 hammers. About 10 pounds, he estimated, and with a longer handle than most people, who did not know metalworking, thought was necessary. He held it near the end. Hot metal gave off sparks, sometimes. He had seen the stars in the hands of the smith from up at Round Hill, a careless fellow. He did not want to make anything elaborate or fancy. Simple things seemed best at the moment. He began by rounding the edges of the bar, then hammered the middle out into a broad blade, almost as thick as the original at the butt. But a good-handed hammer. From time to time, he went back to the coals to keep it a pale yellow, and after a time, he shifted to the lighter hammer, half the way to the first. The piece beyond the blade he thinned down. then bent it over the anvil horn in a curve down beside the blade. A wooden handle could be fitted onto that eventually. Setting the sharp chisel hardy into the anvil's hardy hole, he laid the glowing metal atop it. One sharp blow of the hammer cut off the tool he had made, or almost made. It would be a chamfer knife for smoothing and leveling the tops of barrel staves after they were hocked together, among other things. When he was done, the other man's barrel scrape had made him think of it. As soon as he had made the hot cut, he tossed the glowing metal into the salted quenching barrel. Unsalted gave a harder quench for the hardest metal, while the oil gave the softest for good knives. And swords, he had heard, but he had never had any part in making anything like that. When the metal had cooled enough to a dull gray, he removed it from the water and took it to the grinding wheels. A little slow work with the foot pedals ground a polish onto the blade. Carefully, he heated the blade portion again. This time the colors deepened to straw to bronze. When the bronze color began to run up the blade in waves, he set it aside to cool. The final edge could be sharpened then. Quenching again would destroy the tempering he had just done. A very neat bit of work, the smith said. No wasted motion. You looking for work? My apprentices just walked away, all three of them, the worthless fools. And I've plenty you could do. Baron shook his head. I do not know how long I will be in Tyr. I'd like to work a little longer if you do not mind. It has been a long time and I miss it. Maybe I could do some of the work your apprentices would have done. The smith snorted loudly. You're a deal better than any of those louts, moping around and staring, muttering about their nightmares, as if everyone doesn't have nightmares sometimes. Yes, you can work here as long as you want. I'd have orders for 12 draw knives and 3 cooper's adzes. The carpenter down the street needs a mortise hammer, and too much to list it. Start with the draw knives, and we will see how far we get before night. Baron lost himself in the work, for a time forgetting everything but the heat of the metal, the ring of his hammer, and the smell of the forge. But there came a time when he looked up and found the smith, Dermot Ajala, he had said his name was, taking off his belt, chewing yard dark. A light came from the forge and a pair of lamps, and Zareen was sitting on an anvil by one of the cold forges watching him. So you really are a blacksmith, she said. He is that, mistress, Ajala said. Apprentice, he says, but the work he did today amounts to his master's piece as far as I am concerned. Fine stroking, and better than steady. Baron shifted his feet at the compliments, and the smith grinned at him. Zareen stared at both of them with a lack of comprehension. Baron went to replace the vest and apron on their peg, but once he had them off, he was suddenly conscious of Zareen's eyes on his back. It was as if she were touching him. For a moment, the herbal scent of her seemed overwhelming. He quickly pulled his shirt over his head and stuffed it raggedly into his breeches and jerked on his coat. When he turned around, Zareen wore one of those small, secretive smiles that had always made him nervous. Is this what you mean to do, then? She asked. Did you come all this way to be a blacksmith again? Ajala paused in the act of pulling the yard doors closed and listened. Baron picked up the heavy hammer he had used, a 10-pound head with a handle as long as his forearm. It felt good in his hands. It felt right. The smith had glanced at his eyes once and never even blinked. It was the work that was important, the skill with metal, not the color of a man's eyes. No, he said sadly. One day, I hope, but not yet. He started to hang the hammer back on the wall. Take it. Ajala cleared his throat. I do not usually give away good hammers, but the work you've done today is worth more than the price of that hammer by far. Maybe it will help you to that one day. Man, if I have ever seen anyone made to hold a smith's hammer, it is you. So take it. Keep it. Baron closed his hand around the haft. It did feel right. Thank you, he said. I cannot say what this means to me. Just remember the one day, man. Just you remember it. As they left, Zareen looked up at him and said, You have any idea how strange men are, blacksmith? No, I did not think you did. She darted ahead, leaving him holding the hammer in one hand and scratching his head with the other. No one in the common room looked at him twice, a golden-eyed man carrying a smith's hammer. He went up to his room, remembering for once to light a tallow candle. His quiver and the axe hung from the same peg on the plaster wall. He hefted the axe in one hand, the hammer in the other. By weight of metal, the axe, with its half-moon blade and thick spear, was a good 5 or 6 pounds lighter than the hammer. But it felt 10 times heavier. Replacing the axe in the loop on his belt, he set the hammer on the floor beneath the peg, handle against the wall. The axe haft and hammer haft almost touched. 2 pieces of wood equally thick. 2 pieces of metal, near enough the same weight. For a long time he sat on the stool staring at them. He was still staring when Lan put his head into the room. "Come, blacksmith. We have things to talk over." "I am a blacksmith," Perrin said. And the warder frowned at him. "Don't go winter crazy on me now, blacksmith. If you cannot carry your weight any longer, you may drag us all down the mountain." "I'll carry my weight," Perrin growled. "I will do what has to be done. What do you want?" "You, blacksmith. Don't you listen? Come on, farm boy." That name that Zareen so often called him pulled him to his feet angrily now, but Lan was already turning away. Perrin hurried into the hall, followed him toward the front of the inn, meaning to tell the warder he had had enough of this blacksmith and farm boy. His name was Perrin Ibarra. The warder ducked into the inn's only private dining room, overlooking the street. Perrin followed him. "Now listen, warder, You listen, Perrin," Moraine said. "Be quiet and listen." Her face was smooth, but her eyes looked as grim as her voice sounded. Perrin had not realized anyone was in the room except for himself and the warder, standing with one arm up on the mantel of the unlit fireplace. Moraine sat at the table in the middle of the floor, a simple piece of black oak. None of the other chairs with their high, carved backs were occupied. Zareen was leaning against the wall at the other end of the room from Lan, scowling, and Loyal had chosen to sit on the floor since none of the chairs really fit him. "I'm glad you decided to join us, farm boy," Zareen said sarcastically. "Moraine would not say anything until you came. She just looks at us as if she is deciding which of us is going to die. Be quiet," Moraine told her sharply. "One of the Forsaken is in Tyr. The High Lord Saman is Balal." Perrin shivered. Loyal squeezed his eyes shut and groaned.
I could have remained in steading. I would probably have been very happy, married, whoever my mother chose. She is a fine woman, my mother, and she would not give me to a bad wife.
His ears seemed to have hidden themselves completely in his shaggy hair. "You can go back to studying Shangtai," Moraine said. "Leave now if you wish. I will not stop you." Loyal opened one eye.
I can go?
"If you wish," she said. "Oh." He opened the other eye and scratched his cheek with blunt fingers the size of sausages.
I suppose, if I have a choice, that I will stay with all of you. I have taken a great many notes, but not nearly enough to complete my book. And I would not like to leave Perrin and Rand.
Moraine cut him off in a cold voice. "Good, Loyal. I am glad that you are staying. I will be glad to use any knowledge you have, but until this is done, I have no time to listen to your complaints." "I suppose," Zareen said in an unsteady voice, "that there is no chance of me leaving?" She looked at Moraine and shivered. "I thought not. Blacksmith, if I live through this, I will make you pay." Perrin stared at her. "Me? The fool woman thinks it's my fault? Did I ask her to come?" He opened his mouth, saw the look in Moraine's eyes, and closed it again quickly. After a moment, he said, "Is he after Rand? To stop him or kill him?" "I think not," she said quietly. Her voice was like cold steel. "I fear he means to let Rand enter the heart of the stone and take Kalandor, then take it away from him. I fear he means to kill the Dragon Reborn with the very weapon that is meant to herald him." "Do we run again?" Zareen said. "Like Ilion? I never thought to run, but I never thought to find the Forsaken when I took the Hunter's Oath." This time, Moraine said, we do not run. We dare not run. Worlds and time rest on Rand, on the Dragon Reborn. This time we fight. Baron took a chair uneasily. Moraine, you are saying a lot of things right out that you told us we must not even think about. You do have this room warded against listening, don't you? When she shook her head, he gripped the edge of the table hard enough to make the dark oak creak. I do not speak of a Myrddraal, Baron. No one knows the strength of the Forsaken, except that Ishamael and Lanfear were the strongest. But the weakest of them could sense any warding I might set from a mile or more away, and rip all of us to shreds in seconds, possibly without stirring from where he stood. You're saying he can tie you in knots, Baron muttered. Light, what are we supposed to do? How can we do anything? Even the Forsaken cannot stand up to balefire, she said. He wondered if that was what she had used on the Darkhounds. It still made him uneasy, what he had seen, and what she had said then. I have learned things in the last year, Baron. I am more dangerous than when I came to Emond's Field. If I can come close enough to Bilal, I can destroy him. But if he sees me first, he can destroy us all, long before I have a chance. She turned her attention to Loyal. What can you tell me of Bilal? Baron blinked in confusion. Loyal? Why are you asking him? Zareen burst out angrily. First you tell the blacksmith you mean us to fight one of the Forsaken, who can kill us all before we can even think. And now you ask Loyal about him? Loyal murmured urgently that name she used. But she did not even slow. I knew everything. At least I am smart enough not to say I will fight someone unless I know everything I can of him. You... She trailed off under Moraine's stare, muttering. Ogier, the Aes Sedai said coolly, have long memories, girl. It has been well over 100 generations since the breaking for humans, but less than 30 for Ogier. We still learn things from their stories that we did not know. Now tell me, Loyal, what do you know of Bilal? And briefly for once. I want your long memory, not your long wind. Loyal cleared his throat, a sound much like firewood tumbling down a chute.
Bilal.
His ears flickered out of his hair like hummingbird wings, then snapped down again.
I do not know what can be in the stories about him you do not already know. He is not much mentioned, except in the raising of the Hall of the Servants just before Luz Therin Kinslayer and the 100 Companions sealed him up with the Dark One. Jalanda, son of Arid, son of Koniam, wrote that he was called the Envious, that he forsook the light because he envied Luz Therin, and that he envied Ishamael and Lanfear too. In A Study of the War of the Shadow, Moylin, daughter of Hamada, daughter of Dwendam, called Bilal the Netweaver, but I do not know why. She mentioned him playing a game of stones with Luz Therin and winning, and that he always boasted of it.
He glanced at Moraine and rumbled.
I am trying to be brief. I do not know anything important about you. Several writers say Bilal and Samaya were both leaders in the fight against the Dark One before they forsook the light, and both were masters of the sword. That is truly all I know. He may be mentioned in other books, other stories, but I have not read them. Bilal is just not spoken of very often. I am sorry I could not tell you anything useful.
Perhaps you have, Moraine told him. I did not know of the name, the Netweaver, or that he envied the dragon as well as his companions in the shadows. That strengthens my belief that he wants Kalendor. That must be the reason he has chosen to make himself a High Lord of Tyr. The Netweaver. A name for a schemer, a patient and cunning planner. You have done well, Loyal. For a moment, the Ogier's wide mouth curved up in a pleased smile, but then it curved down again. I will not pretend I am not afraid, Zareen said suddenly. Only a fool would not be afraid of the Forsaken. But I swore I would be one of you, and I will. That is all I wanted to say. Baron shook his head. She must be crazy. I could wish I were not one of this party. I could wish I were back home working Master Luhan's forge. Aloud, he said, if he is inside the stone, if he is waiting there for Rand, we must go inside to reach him. How do we do that? Everyone keeps saying no one enters the stone without the permission of the High Lords, and looking at it, I don't see any way but through the gates. You do not go in, Lan said. Moraine and I will be the only ones to enter. The more who go, the harder it will be. Whatever way in I find, I cannot believe it will be easy even for only two. Guy Dean, Moraine began in a firm voice, but the warder cut her off with one just as firm. We go together, Moraine. I will not stand aside this time. After a moment, she nodded. Perrin thought he saw Lan relax. The rest of you had better get some sleep, the warder went on. I have to be out studying the stone. He paused. There is a thing that your news drove out of my head, Moraine. A small thing, and I cannot see what it might mean. There are Aiel in Tyr.
Aiel?
Loyal exclaimed.
Impossible. The entire city would be in a panic if one Aiel came through the gates.
I did not say they were walking the streets, Ogier. The rooftops and chimneys of the city make as good hiding as the waste. I saw no less than 3, though apparently no one else in Tyr has seen any of them. And if I saw 3, you can be sure there are many times that I did not see. It means nothing to me, Moraine said slowly. Perrin, why are you frowning in that way? He had not known that he was frowning. I was thinking about that Aiel. He said that when the stone falls, the Aiel will leave the threefold land. That's the waste, isn't it? He said it was a prophecy. I have read every word of the prophecies of the dragon, Moraine said softly. In every translation, there is no mention of the Aiel. We stagger blindly while Belial weaves his nets, and the wheel weaves the pattern around us. But are the Aiel the wheels weaving, or Belial's? Lan, you must find me the way into the stone quickly. Us. Find us a way in quickly. As you command, Aes Sedai, he said, but his tone was more warm than formal. He vanished through the door. Moraine frowned at the table, eyes clouded in thought. Zareen came over to look down at Perrin, her head tilted to one side. And what are you going to do, blacksmith? It seems they mean us to wait and watch while they go adventuring. Not that I will complain. He doubted that last. First, he told her, I'm going to have something to eat. And then I'm going to think about a hammer. Try to puzzle out how I feel about you, Falcon.
Chapter 51. Bait for the net. From the corner of her eye, Nynaeve thought she glimpsed a tall man with reddish hair and a swirling brown cloak well down the sunlit street. But as she turned to peer from under the wide brim of the blue straw hat Aelwyn had given her, an ox-drawn wagon was already lumbering between them. When it lurched on, the man was nowhere to be seen. She was almost certain that had been a wooden flute case on his back, and his clothes were certainly not Tyron. It couldn't be Rand. Just because I keep dreaming about him does not mean he is going to come all the way from Almouth Plain. One of the barefoot men hurrying past, with the sickle-shaped tails of a dozen large fish sticking up from the basket on his back, suddenly tripped, catapulting silver-scaled fish over his head as he fell. He landed on hands and knees in the mud, staring at the fish that had come out of his basket. Every one of the long, sleek shapes stood upright, stuck nose down in the mud, forming a neat circle. Even a few passers-by gaped at that. Slowly, the man got to his feet, apparently unaware of the mud on him. Unslinging his basket, he began gathering the fish back into it, shaking his head and muttering to himself. Nynaeve blinked, but her business was with this cow-faced brigand facing her in the doorway of his shop with bloody cuts of meat hanging from hooks behind him. She gave her braid a tug and fixed the fellow with her eye. Very well, she said sharply. I will take it. But if this is what you charge for so poor a cut, you'll not have more business from me. He shrugged placidly as he took her coins, then wrapped the fatty mutton roast in a cloth she produced from the basket on her arm. She glared at him as she put the wrapped meat into the basket, but that did not affect him. She whirled to stalk away and nearly fell. She was still not used to these clogs. They kept sticking in the mud, and she could not see how the folk who wore them managed. She hoped this sunshine dried the ground soon, but she had a feeling that the mud was more or less permanent in the mole. Stepping gingerly, she started back toward Aylwyn's house, muttering under her breath. The prices were outrageous for everything, the quality inevitably poor, and almost no one seemed to care, not the people buying or those selling. It was a relief to pass a woman shouting at a shopkeeper, waving a bruised reddish-yellow fruit. Nynaeve did not know what. They had a good many fruits and vegetables she had never heard of here, in each hand, and calling for everyone to see what refuse the man sold. But the shopkeeper only stared at her wearily, not even bothering to argue back. There was some excuse for the prices, she knew. Elaine had explained all about the grain being eaten by rats in the granaries, because no one in Kyrian could buy, and how big the Kyrian and grain trade had become since the Aiel War. But nothing excused the way everyone seemed ready to lie down and die. She had seen hail ruin food crops in the Two Rivers, and grasshoppers eat them, and Black Tongue kill the sheep, and Red Spot wither the tabac, so there was nothing to sell when the merchants came down from Bear Lawn. She could remember 2 years in a row when there had been little to eat except turnip soup and old barley, and hunters had been lucky to bring home a scrawny rabbit. But Two Rivers folk picked themselves up when they were knocked down and went back to work. These people had had only one bad year, and their fisheries and their other trade seemed to be flourishing. She had no patience with them. The trouble was, she knew she should have a little patience. They were odd people with odd ways, and things she took for cringing, they seemed to see as a matter of course, even Aylwyn and Sandar. She should be able to summon up just a little patience. If for them, why not for Egwene? She put that aside. The child behaved wretchedly, snapping at the most obvious suggestions, objecting to the most sensible things. Even when it was plain what they should do, Egwene wanted to be convinced. Nynaeve was not used to having to convince people, especially not people she had changed swaddling clothes for. The fact that she was only a matter of 7 years older than Egwene was of no account. It is all those bad dreams, she told herself. I cannot understand what they mean, and now Elaine and I are having them too, and I do not know what that means either. And Sandar won't say anything except that he is still looking, and I am so frustrated I could just spit. She jerked her braid so hard it hurt. At least she had been able to convince Egwene not to use the Turangrial again, to put the thing back in her pouch instead of wearing it next to her skin always. If the Black Aja was in Talairan Riod, she did not want to think about that possibility. We will find them. I will bring them down, she muttered. Trying to sell me like a sheep, hunting me like an animal. I am the hunter this time, not the rabbit. That Moiraine. If she had never come to Emmons Field, I could have taught Egwene enough. And Rand, I could have done something. That she knew neither was true did not help. It made it worse. She hated Moiraine almost as much as she hated Leandrin and the Black Aja, maybe as much as she hated the Shanchan. She rounded a corner, and Julian Sandar had to leap out of her way to keep from being trampled. Even used to them as he was, he nearly tripped over his own clogs, only his staff saving him from falling on his face in the mud. That pale, ridged wood was called bamboo, she had learned, and it was stronger than it looked. Mistress Mariam, Sandar said, regaining his balance, I was looking for you. He flashed her a nervous smile. Are you angry? Why are you frowning at me that way? She smoothed her forehead. I was not frowning at you, Master Sandar. The butcher... It does not matter. Why are you looking for me? Her breath caught. Have you found them? He looked around as if he suspected the passers-by of trying to listen. Yes, yes, you must come back with me. The others are waiting. And Mother Gwenna. Why are you so nervous? You did not let them discover your interest, she said sharply. What has frightened you? No, no, mistress. I did not reveal myself. His eyes darted again, and he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a breathy, urgent whisper. These women you seek, they are in the stone, beasts of High Lord. The High Lord's salmon. Why did you call them thieves? The High Lord's salmon, he almost squeaked. There was sweat on his face. Inside the stone, with a High Lord. Light. How do we reach them now? She suppressed her impatience with an effort. Be easy, she said soothingly. Be at ease, Master Sandar. We can explain everything to your satisfaction. I hope we can. Light, if he goes running to the stone to tell this High Lord we are searching for them, come with me to Mother Gwenna's house. Jocelyn, Carola, and I will explain it all to you. Truly. Come. He gave a short, uneasy nod and walked alongside her, keeping his pace to what she could manage with the clogs. He looked as if he wanted to run. At the wise woman's house, she hurried around to the back. No one ever used the front door that she had seen, not even Mother Gwenna herself. The horses were tied to a bamboo hitching rail now, well away from Ailwyn's new figs, as well as her vegetables, with their saddles and bridles stored inside. For once she did not stop to pat Guydine's nose and tell him he was a good boy and more sensible than his namesake. Sandar halted to scrape mud from his clogs with the butt of his staff, but she hurried inside. Ailwyn Gwenna was sitting in one of her high-backed chairs pulled out into the room, her arms at her sides. The gray-haired woman's eyes were bulging with anger and fear, and she struggled furiously without moving a muscle. Nynaeve did not need to sense the supple weaving of air to know what had happened. Light! They've found us! Burn you, Sandar! Rage flooded her, washed away the walls inside that usually kept her from the power, and as the basket fell from her hands, she was a white blossom on a blackthorn bush, opening to embrace Saidar, opening. It was as if she had run into another wall, a wall of clear glass. She could feel the true source, but the wall stopped everything except the ache to be filled with the one power. The basket hit the floor, and as it bounced, the door behind her opened and Leandrin stepped in, followed by a black-haired woman with a white streak above her left ear. They wore long, colorful silk dresses cut to bare their shoulders, and the glow of Saidar surrounded them. Leandrin smoothed her red dress and smiled with that pouting rosebud mouth. Her doll's face was filled with amusement. You see, do you not, Wilder? She began. You have no... Nynaeve hit her in the mouth as hard as she could. Light, I have to get away. She backhanded Rihanna so hard the black-haired woman fell on her silk-covered rump with a grunt. They must have the others, but if I can make it out the door, if I can get far enough away they can't shield me, I can do something. She pushed Leandrin hard, shoving her away from the door. Just let me escape their shielding and I'll... Blows hit her from every side, like fists and sticks.
Hey, Enforcer, how you doing,
Nearly
bro?
Leandrin, blood trickling
Thanks for
from the
stopping
corner
by.
of her now grim mouth, nor Rihanna, her hair as disarrayed as her green
Hope
dress,
you're doing good
lifted a
tonight.
hand. Nynaeve could feel the flows of air weaving about her as well as she could feel the blows themselves. She still struggled to reach the door, but she realized that she was on her knees now, and the unseen blows would not stop. Invisible sticks and fists striking at her back and her stomach, her head and her hips, her shoulders, her breasts, her legs, her head. Groaning, she fell onto her side and curled into a ball, trying to protect herself. Oh, Light, I tried. Egwene,
Oh, shit,
Elaine,
that
I
sucks.
tried. I will not cry out. Burn you, you can beat me to death, but I won't cry. The blows stopped, but Nynaeve could not stop quivering. She felt bruised and battered from crown to toe. Leandrin crouched beside her, arms around her knees, silk rustling.
Always sucks when you can't get no
She
sleep.
wiped the blood away from her mouth. Her dark eyes were hard, and there was no amusement on her face now. Perhaps you are too stupid to know when you are defeated, Wilder. You fought almost as wildly as that other foolish girl, that Egwene. She almost went mad. You must all learn to submit. You will learn to submit. Nynaeve shivered and reached for Saidar again. It was not that she had any real hope, but she had to do something. Forcing through her
That's your
pain,
third
she
day.
reached out
Damn, that really
and
sucks, bro.
struck that invisible shield. Leandrin did have amusement back in her eyes now, the grim mirth of a nasty child who pulls the wings off flies. We have no use for this one, at least, Rhianna said, standing beside Aylwyn. I will stop her heart. Aylwyn's eyes nearly came out of her head. No! Leandrin's short, honey-colored braids swung as her head snapped around. Always you kill too quickly, and only the great lord can make use of the dead. She smiled at the woman held to the chair by invisible bonds. You saw the soldiers who came with us, old woman. You know who waits for us in the stone. The High Lord Salmon. He will not be pleased if you speak of what happened inside your house today. If you hold your tongue, you will live, perhaps to serve him again one day. If you speak, you will serve only the great Lord of the Dark from beyond the grave. Which do you choose? Suddenly, Aylwyn could move her head. She shook her gray curls, working her mouth. I will hold my tongue, she said dejectedly, then gave Nynaeve an embarrassed, shamed look. If I speak, what good will it do? A High Lord could have my head by raising an eyebrow. What good can I do you, girl? What good? It is all right, Nynaeve said wearily. Who could she tell? All she could do is die. I know you would help if you could. Rhianna threw back her head and laughed. Aylwyn slumped, released completely, but she only sat there, staring at her hands in her lap. Between them, Leandrin and Rhianna pulled Nynaeve to her feet and pushed her toward the front of the house. You give us any trouble, the black-haired woman said in a hard voice, and I will make you peel off your own skin and dance in your bones. Nynaeve almost laughed. What trouble could I give? She was shielded from the true source. Her bruises ached so much she could barely stand. Anything she might do, they could handle like a child's tantrum.
Oh, damn.
The bruises will heal, burn you, and you'll make a slip yet. And when you do... There were others in the front room of the house. 2 big soldiers in rimmed round helmets and shiny breastplates over their
Hell yeah,
red coats.
Enforcer.
The 2 men had sweat
I'm
on their
probably
faces,
about to do the
and their
same
dark
too.
eyes rolled as if they were as afraid as she. Amiko Nagoyan was there, slender and pretty with her long neck and pale skin, looking as innocent as a girl gathering.
Definitely hope you get some sleep,
Joya
Enforcer.
Beer had a friendly face despite that smooth-cheeked calm of a woman who has worked long with the power, almost a grandmother's face in its welcoming appearance, though her age had put no touch of gray in her dark hair, any more than it had wrinkled her skin. Her gray eyes looked more like those of the stepmother in the stories, the one who murdered the children of her husband's first wife.
Hell yeah,
Both
Enforcer.
women shone with the power. Elaine stood between the 2 black sisters with a bruised eye and a swollen cheek and a split lip, one sleeve of her dress torn halfway off. I am sorry, Nynaeve, she said thickly, as if her jaw hurt. We never saw them until it was too late. Egwene lay in a crumpled heap on the floor, her face swollen with bruises, almost unrecognizable. As Nynaeve and her escort came in, one of the big soldiers hoisted Egwene over his shoulder. She dangled there as limply as a half-empty barley sack. What did you do to her? Nynaeve demanded. Burn you, what? Something unseen struck her across the mouth, hard enough to make her eyes go blank for a moment. Now, Joya Bier said, with a smile that her eyes belied. I will not stand for demands or bad language. She sounded like a grandmother, too. You speak when you are spoken to. I told you, the girl, she would not stop fighting, yes? Leandrin said. Let it be a lesson to you. If you try to cause any trouble, you will be treated no more gently. Nynaeve ached to do something for Egwene, but she let herself be pushed out into the street. She made them push her. It was a small way of fighting back. refusing to cooperate, but it was all she had at the moment. There were few people in the muddy street, as if everyone had decided it was much better to be somewhere else, and those few scurried by on the other side without a glance at the shiny black lacquered coach standing behind a team of 6 matched whites with tall white plumes on their bridles. A coachman dressed like the soldiers but without armor or sword sat on the seat, and another opened the door as they appeared from the house. Before he did, Nynaeve saw the sigil painted there, a silver gauntleted fist clutching jagged lightning bolts. She supposed it was High Lord Salmon's sign. A dark friend he must be if he deals with the Black Ajah. The light burn him. But she was more interested in the man who dropped to his knees in the mud at their appearance. "Burn you, Sandar! Why?" She jumped as something that felt like a stick of wood struck her across the shoulders. Joya Bier smiled chidingly and waggled a finger. "You will be respectful, child, or you might lose that tongue." Leandrin laughed. Tangling a hand in Sandar's black hair, she wrenched his head back. He stared up at her with the eyes of a faithful hound, or of a cur expecting a kick. "Do not be too hard on this man." She even made man sound like dog. "He had to be persuaded to serve. But I am very good at persuading, no?" She laughed again. Sandar turned a confused stare on Nynaeve. "I had to do it, Mistress Mariam. I had to." Leandrin twisted his hair, and his eyes went back to her, the anxious hounds once more. Light, Nynaeve thought. What did they do to him? What are they going to do to us? She and Elaine were bundled roughly into the coach, with Egwene slumped between them, her head lolling, and Leandrin and Rhianna climbed in and took the seat facing forward. The glow of Saidar still surrounded them. Where the others went, Nynaeve did not much care at that moment. She wanted to reach Egwene, to touch her, to comfort her hurts, but she could not move a muscle below her neck except to writhe. Flows of air bound the 3 of them like layers of tightly wrapped blankets. The coach lurched into motion, swaying hard in the mud despite its leather springs. "If you have hurt her..." Light, I can see they've hurt her. Why don't I say what I mean? But it was almost as hard to force the words out as it would have been to lift a hand. "If you have killed her, I won't rest till you are all hunted down like wild dogs." Rhianna glared, but Leandrin only sniffed. "Do not be a complete fool, Wilder. You are wanted alive. Dead bait will catch nothing." "Bait? For what? For who?" "You are the fool, Leandrin. Do you think we are here alone? Only 3 of us and not even full Aes Sedai? We are bait, Leandrin, and you have walked into the trap like a fat grouse." "Do not tell her that," Elaine said sharply, and Nynaeve blinked before she realized Elaine was helping her fabrication. "If you let your anger get the best of you, you will tell them what they must not hear. They must take us inside the stone. They must..." "Be quiet," Nynaeve snapped. "You are letting your tongue run away with you." Elaine managed to look abashed behind her bruises. Let them chew on that, Nynaeve thought. But Leandrin only smiled. "Once your time as bait is done, you will tell us everything. You will want to. They say you will be very strong one day, but I will make sure you will always obey me, even before the great Master Balal works his plans for you. He is sending for Murdral, 13 of them." Those rosebud lips laughed the final words. Nynaeve felt her stomach twist. One of the Forsaken. Her brain numbed with shock. The Dark One and all the Forsaken are bound in Shaial Ghul, bound by the Creator in the moment of creation. But the Catechism did not help. She knew too well how much of it was false. Then the rest of it came home to her. 13 Murdral. And 13 sisters of the Black Ajah. She heard Elaine screaming before she realized she was screaming herself, jerking uselessly in those invisible bombs of air. It was impossible to say which was louder, their despairing screams, or the laughter from Leandrin and Rhianna.
Chapter 52. In Search of a Remedy. Slumped on the stool in the Gleeman's room, Matt grimaced as Tom coughed again. How are we going to keep looking if he's so bloody sick he can't walk? He was ashamed as soon as he thought it. Tom had been as assiduous in searching as he had, pushing himself day and night when he had to know he was coming down sick. Matt had been so absorbed in his hunt that he had paid too little attention to Tom's coughing. The change from constant rain to steamy heat had not helped it. Come on, Tom, he said. Lopar says there's a wise woman not far. That is what they call a wisdom here. A wise woman. Wouldn't Nynaeve like that?
I do. Any foul-tasting concoctions poured down my throat, boy.
Tom stuffed a fist through his mustaches in a vain attempt to stop his hacking. You go ahead looking. Just give me a few hours on my bed, and I'll join you. The racking wheezes doubled him over till his head was almost on his knees. So I'm supposed to do all the work while you take your ease? Matt said lightly. How can I find anything without you? You learn most of what we hear. That was not exactly true. Men talked as freely over dice as they did while buying a Gleeman a cup of wine. More freely than they did with a Gleeman hacking so hard they feared contagion. But he was beginning to think that Tom's cough was not going to go away by itself. If the old goat dies on me, who will I play stones with? He told himself roughly. Anyway, your bloody coughing keeps me awake even in the next room. Ignoring the white-haired man's protests, he pulled Tom to his feet. He was shocked at how much weight he had to support. Despite the damp heat, Tom insisted on his patch-covered cloak. Matt had his own coat unbuttoned completely and all three ties of his shirt undone. But he let the old goat have his way. No one in the common room even looked up as he half-carried Tom out into the muggy afternoon. The innkeeper had given simple directions, but when they reached the gate and faced the mud of the mola, Matt almost turned back to ask another wise woman. There had to be more than one in a city this size. Tom's wheezing decided him. With a grimace, Matt stepped off into the mud, half carrying the Gleeman. He had thought from the directions that they must have passed the wise woman's house on their way up from the dock that first night. When he saw the long, narrow house with bunches of herbs hanging in the windows, right next to a potter's shop, he remembered it. Lopar had said something about going to the back door, but he had had enough of mud. And the stink of fish, he thought, frowning at the barefoot men squelching by with their baskets on their backs. There were tracks of horses in the street, too, just beginning to be obliterated by feet and ox carts. Horses pulling a wagon. He had seen oxen drawing carts or wagons, either one had seen. The nobles and the merchants were proud of their fine stock and never let one be put to anything like work. But he had not seen carriages since leaving the walled city either. Dismissing horses and wheel tracks from his mind, he took Tom to the front door and knocked. After a time, he knocked again. Then again. He was on the phone, moving up and returning to the White Crescent despite Tom's shoulder when he heard shuffling footsteps inside. The door opened barely more than a crack, and a stout, gray-haired woman peered out. What do you want? She asked in a tired voice. Matt put on his best grin. But I am getting sick myself at all these people who sound like there's no bloody hope. Mother Gwynna? My name is Matt Coffin.
Alright,
Come on,
everyone,
told me you
call
might do
into
something
this
for my
life for
friend's
right
car.
now.
I can pay well.
I want to thank everyone stopping
She
by.
studied them a moment,
Everyone that keeps
listened
stopping
to
by
Tom's
and chilling
wheezes,
with
then
me.
sighed.
Till next
I
time, everyone.
suppose I can
Stay
still
safe out there.
at least. You might as well come in.